Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay, just don't. Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you so much for having me. It is a pleasure to be here again after first coming for Funda Festival in January. So I'm here to speak to you all today a little bit about my identity and my life moving through the world as a queer, Black teacher and playwright. The term queer has a deep history of being derogatory, but in more recent years has been reclaimed more generally to describe folks who identify as something other than strictly heterosexual. Queerness is experienced in different ways from person to person. In my case, I identify outside the gender binary, that is to say, man or woman. Now here it's important to make the distinction between gender and sex because they are often used interchangeably, but they are not the same thing. Sex, basically, sex is what's in your pants and gender is what is in your mind. It's how you express yourself. The way I present and express myself, that has nothing to do with my body. So while I identify as queer, I also identify as gender non-conforming and non-binary. Now these are labels that fall under the heading of transgender. And so I also consider myself a trans person of color. So I'm going to pause here and do a little vocabulary lesson because I know that some of this language can be confusing to people, and the biggest, I think, fear that folks have around this language is just that they're going to seem like a bigot if they're asking questions. But the best thing you can do is ask questions because then it looks like you care and you're trying to take that extra step. You don't look stupid, and that's the most important part. So when Johnny introduced me, you might have noticed that she was talking about the things that I do, and that for the pronouns that she used for me, she used they. Because I don't really feel like a she, and I don't really feel like a he, but our language and our society is just set up in a way that there is no in-between, there is no option, so we've had to create language around options. So many people will identify as non-binary, being outside the gender binary, and some people will identify as being gender non-conforming, so not conforming to our regular standards of what gender is supposed to be. So those are all things that fall under the transgender community. And like I said, they differ from person to person. I prefer they, them, their pronouns, but I'm fine with she, her pronouns, mostly because my family uses the she, her pronouns, and that's something that's kind of been hard for them to switch. And a lot of people say, oh, but it's grammatically incorrect. Which is funny to me because it's grammatically incorrect according to the American standards of English, which is one set of language rules. But for those who are concerned, for example, Rachel Maddox came to speak to my church today. They are so cool. Rachel's here, and their partner, Eva, is also here. So those are kind of the, a kind of crash course in some of the language around transgender and the trans community, and it's not, and people are scared, but it's not scary. It's just like, in the children's message, like the difference is, it's a difference, and it's something that can make us powerful and that can help us continue to educate people so that they don't see those differences as something that they should inherently fear. And if you have any questions, by all means ask them, because that's what we're here for. So, as a young person, working in two highly undervalued and undersupported industries. My schedule remains at best inconsistent. I move with a lot of consciousness, awareness of my surroundings, like for example, if I'm the only Black person in the room or in the store. I am perceived in a lot of different ways. Many people think I'm a boy or a man. I've been called sir more times than I can count. And then they perceive me as a threat. I am often evaluated initially by people based on my queerness and my Blackness. So if people think that I'm a Black man, they'll move their purse away from me or pull their child to the other side of them when they're walking down the street. Or when I correct someone who has called me sir, they tilt their head with a confused look, as though that must be impossible. As a gender non-conforming person, I pretty regularly avoid public bathrooms. I've had people come in and tell me I'm in the wrong bathroom, and I've had people open the door and see me and then check. And it sounds benign, but if you think about something as simple and as private as using the restroom and having someone come into that experience and try and take it away from you, it's horrible. It's horrible. I was taking the train home to see my family in New Jersey for Mother's Day, and I was sitting in Providence Station and I really had to go to the bathroom. But the train was coming kind of soon, and I kept looking at the bathroom because I always try to look for a single one, or one that says gender neutral, which could happen or not happen depending on where you are, and there wasn't one. And I chose going to the bathroom on the train over going to the bathroom there. I was like, I would prefer to go to the filthy bathroom on the train that, you know, where nothing feels right, nothing's clean, you know? But, you know, those are the kinds of things that I consistently experience. And they're really, they're hurtful and they're damaging. And I think it's important for people, for everybody, but for people who are in a position of not being transgender, and maybe not being a person of color, to understand how that feels and how that can affect somebody. So, while being Black and queer are two parts of my identity, they are far from being the only ones. I've always had a love of language, owing in great part to my two grandmothers, both of whom are former elementary school teachers. I would spend hours in my grandma's lap rocking back and forth as she read me story after story. She told me I could have sat like that with her all day. Now, both of my grandmothers, having grown up Black in the South and Southwest, really only had two options in terms of a career, nurse or teacher. So their race almost automatically informed their career path. As soon as I was old enough, though, I was desperate to learn to read on my own. Being one of a small handful of children of color in my kindergarten class, and struggling to learn how to read made it all too easy for my teacher to put me in lowest reading group in class. But this did little to dampen my determination for literacy. I went into first grade knowing how to read. And that was because I had spent the summer painstakingly practicing with both my father, an educator who has dyslexia, so the most patient man in the world, and my maternal grandmother, who taught kindergarten for 40 years. Love of language and a desire to foster that in young people, that's in my blood. It runs through my veins. I became and continue to be a voracious reader, which fostered an interest in writing. Now, I read just about anything, but when it comes to writing, plays are my absolute sweet spot, and I'll tell you why. A play is a story told in two ways, on the page and on the stage. It's a story that you get to see unfold, recounted, relived right in front of you. And if you're lucky, by people who look like you. The stories I tell, the characters and worlds that I put on the stage, they're reflections of what I've seen and experienced as a queer person of color. I write what I know, and what I know is my truth. As a playwright, it is essential that I bring narratives to the stage that aren't often or ever brought there. My most recent play, Destructive Behaviors, discusses the experience being a student of color in predominantly white classrooms. I studied theater and education in college, and I wanted the culmination of my studies to be a marriage of these two disciplines. But when I researched these topics, everything that came up was about the school-to-prison pipeline and the criminalization of Black youth in inner-city schools. And while that is one aspect of my desire to educate, that has not been my own personal educational experience. My experience in school was suburban and almost entirely white, which meant that I almost always stood out. My natural enthusiasm and reactive nature was often misread as aggression or a threat. I spent most of first grade sitting outside the classroom because I had gotten upset or frustrated about something and the teacher sent me out for being too much. I got suspended in first grade and in second grade. This was at a Quaker school. I'm not bad enough, they're great folks, I'm not bad enough, it's an important thing to distinguish. Now, this didn't happen to the white children in my class when they got upset. And that isn't an attack, these are facts. This is what it is to be a person of color in a school with mostly white kids and almost exclusively white teachers. I just saw myself as me, but many of my teachers labeled me as difficult, aggressive, disruptive. I heard it enough from teachers that I began to internalize it and think that I just wasn't smart. Destructive Behaviors centers around Trapper, a high school student who has always struggled in school, and how those struggles affect her self-esteem and sense of self-worth. Trapper's flashbacks to certain experiences and real-time conversations with an unnamed overseer take place in what could be a demolished classroom or could be a juvenile detention center. I put real problems in settings not immediately familiar, which helps an audience engage more actively with an otherwise difficult topic to discuss. I didn't see myself in any narratives, so I put myself there. And that is what I continuously seek to do as a playwright and as a teacher. I became a teacher so I could be the teacher that I didn't have. I also believe the spirit of educating lives in me through my grandmothers, both of whom are still alive, 90 and 96. Yeah, they And I use that spirit to do what I can to give kids a teacher who looks like them. My grandma, the kindergarten teacher, says that her teaching jumped out of her and into me, and that couldn't be truer. The love that both of my grandmothers had for their students also came from the groundwork of each of their spiritualities. When they were more mobile, they were both churchgoers. And I myself was raised in the Presbyterian church and baptized prior to that in the Congregational church. Growing up in a church of my own taught me invaluable lessons about connection, sacredness, and community. There are aspects of my education in Sunday school that I still use in some of my teaching. And oh, let's not forget the sermons. Now, when I say I was raised in the church, I mean we went just about every Sunday. I was in the choir, and I went to Sunday school, and then I became a junior usher. So each year, there would be a youth Sunday service that was led by the young folks in the church, and 2 or 3 people would get chosen to write a little sermonette, is what they called it. And I did it, twice. I attribute much of my public speaking and storytelling ability to this, but it also gave me an opportunity to speak about my spirituality on my own terms, which is a powerful thing. I went to college out of state, so I was no longer going to be at church every Sunday, but I did go back during the breaks my freshman year to usher, see my friends, and say hi to people. Now, prior to college, I had cut my then shoulder-length hair into more or less what you see up there right now, except it was straightened into a mohawk. It was a look, and it was cool. But every time I came back to church, someone would comment on my appearance. At my first service, after I cut my hair, a bunch of ladies were like, I can't believe you cut all your beautiful hair off. Why would you cut all that beautiful hair off? And, like, what do I even say to that? And I would come, so I came back for a break, and the same woman said, oh, you still got that haircut, huh? You know, insinuating that I wasn't ladylike for having short hair. And it was at this point that I stopped going to church. I wasn't comfortable, and that wasn't fair. And I think it's important to understand that for many people, queer identity is not reconcilable with any kind of spirituality. My spirituality continues to be on my own terms, but not because of those comments, because of the spirit of love instilled in me by my grandmothers. Like I said, they are both God-loving gals. My kindergarten teacher grandmother still gets her communion delivered to her every month. They really, truly are. But whenever I think back on the role that played in their relationship with me and my brother and my cousins, the foundation was always that of love. They always taught me that God or spirituality or religion in any and all of its forms is about love. And that love is unconditional. It doesn't see blackness or queerness, and it doesn't pick and choose. Thank you.